Welcome to the first episode of Beyond Talking Points. I'm Matt with my co-host Matt. So on this show, we're going to talk about a lot of big issues in the news. We're going to cover a lot of topics that we find interesting throughout the week that are related to politics, culture, sometimes even philosophy. We have a lot of stuff we want to talk about. We just kind of feel out each other's ideas, push back a little bit, and we kind of talk through the news so we really understand how we feel about things and why. So since this is our first episode, I just wanted to briefly introduce myself, and then my co-host will introduce himself as well. My name's Matt. So I'm a recent undergrad economics major. So I got my degree last year. I'm really interested in econ, but I also became very interested in politics for that reason throughout my undergraduate education. I used to think I was a really Republican-leaning person. I grew up in a really liberal area, so I just thought I was hyper-conservative, and I actually grew into this feeling that I'm far more of a libertarian, and that's where my principles truly lie. So in the last couple of years, I've found my roots there. Matt, how about you give us a few words about yourself and introduce the first topic we're going to talk about, because we just want to dive in.
Thank you, Matt. Well, as he said, my name is also Matt, or you can call me Matthew. I think that's how we're going to distinguish ourselves in the show. I'm 19 years old. I'll be 20 not too far away. I'm taking classes at my local community college, freshman year. Haven't declared a major yet. And I got into politics around middle school, late middle school, early high school. I come from a pretty traditional Democrat background. Most of my family members are mainstream Democrats. And I ran into a friend of mine actually in middle school. Started saying things that that contradicted what I had heard at home. So I started doing research, to try to rebut him. One thing led to another, and next thing I know, I'm avidly paying attention to the news. As for my ideology, it's difficult to say. I've kind of moved away from the genteel liberalism of my familial background. I've flirted with certain things, flirted with some Marxism, some anarchism. But for now, I can't really put a name on myself.
Nice. I like that. You elaborate on that a lot more than I did. Okay, so we're going to talk about the recent debate between Jordan Peterson and I cannot pronounce this debate opponent's name, Zizek, I'm pretty sure.
Slavoj Zizek.
There you go. Let's start from where you want to start, and we'll go back and forth on a few things. I do want to say, for anybody who didn't listen to the debate, it's kind of all over the place. It was framed as a conversation about happiness and the concept through the frame of Marxism and capitalism, but they got off topic a lot, and there's just a lot to discuss there.
Indeed, as I was saying before we started recording, that they really went all over the place. They agreed on some things. They disagreed on some things. I would imagine that you are a bit more pro Peterson, but of course, obviously, you can elaborate. I won't put words in your mouth. I'm a bit more for Zizek. I would say I agree with Peterson maybe 50% of the time, and Zizek maybe 75% of the time. But jumping right into the debate topics, I just found it interesting because I think we're at a this sounds a bit cliche, but I think it's true. We're sort of at a turning point in human civilization. And I think we're questioning our first principles. We're questioning our values. What people do we want to be? What kind of society do we want to lead, or do we want to live in? And that's really what is at the heart of the debate, or maybe it would be more aptly called a discussion. Peterson, of course, is very pro-capitalism, although he acknowledges capitalism has its flaws. I think he quoted Winston Churchill as saying, democracy is the worst form of government except all the others, and he paraphrased saying capitalism is the worst economic system except for all the others. And then Zizek, although I think he later on he elaborated, he considers himself more of a Hegelian, nevertheless believes that capitalism in this in the way it currently exists will not be able to deal with environmental disasters, won't be able to deal with artificial intelligence, won't be able to deal with let me backtrack a bit. I think, and stop me anytime, of course, I don't mean to go on and on. I think Zizek's main concern is, I think he brought up China. He said that China exemplifies a very effective form of capitalism with an authoritarian state. And I think that's one of Zizek's main points. He believes that capitalism will no longer lead to the freedom that it historically has and will lead to more authoritarianism. I think that's probably the main thrust.
That's kind of what he was getting at. And at first I thought he was praising China, but he was actually terrified of it. And that was his whole point.
Yes, and of course, on the flip side, Peterson believes that, or I don't actually think he really talked much about China or China's role in this. I consider him basically a traditionalist. I think he's very, very suspicious of any especially any radical change. And so I think he would say that capitalism with all its flaws this is as good as it's going to get. I think he mentioned that poverty has declined in recent decades. So
what I'm seeing, like in that part of their conversation, was I think there's two kind of topics that they dissect. The first thing that they hit on a lot that I think is, I think I strongly, I have different feelings towards this than you, is Peterson's defense of capitalism, as capitalism being like the least worst form of a system. That's essentially what he's saying. That was essentially his defense of capitalism. And when you watch the debate, Peterson's whole opening half hour is a breakdown of the Communist Manifesto and why the Communist Manifesto is essentially a piece of garbage document. He's like, here's 10 things wrong with it. These 10 things are all stupid and ignorant if you think about them for 2 seconds. So Marxism's bad. Capitalism isn't too bad because at least it helps everybody, even though there's inequality. And then the interesting part of the debate is Zizek doesn't really tell him he's wrong on capitalism or Marxism, and they kind of, neither of them really love either. And Zizek is actually kind of says the Communist Manifesto is a really bad explainer for Marxism, and read other works of Marx and you'll get a better idea, which is, it's kind of like a definitional argument. If most people's, but let's not get into that. I want to talk about capitalism being the least worst form of a system.
Well, if I can jump in really quickly, then I'll let you
go ahead.
You finish. I find it. I just thought of it this way. I kind of, the more I think about it, it's almost as if we have a Marxist who's not defending Marxism and a capitalist who's not defending capitalism.
That's pretty much exactly what it was.
So
which is why I had a problem with it, because I'm pro-capitalism, because I think the big part that's left out about capitalism all the time is that capitalism is about people being able to consent to transactions without limits, right? So like if you buy something from me, you think that the item's worth more than how much you pay for it, and I think the money is worth more than the item, and then we each benefit. Great, that's capitalism. And instead of talking about how capitalism is great for protecting freedoms because people can do what they want. People have a bunch of choice. And then they do later talk about how like Jordan Peterson specifically talks about how individualism is really important. And I think capitalism is the best way to being able to pursue things that you like the most as an individual. So they essentially gloss over how the whole premise of capitalism is free commerce. It's literally definitionally freedom is embedded in capitalism. And then they say that's just the least worst, which is kind of, to me, missing that whole point. He could have talked about how it's great because people get to make their own choices and do what they want. But instead, he spent all the time essentially accepting the argument of inequality is bad, which I don't think inequality is the worst thing ever unless there's poverty at the bottom. And his whole point was, at least with the inequality in capitalism, there's not poverty in the bottom because capitalism brings people up. Capitalism invents fridges and dishwashers and all these things and different ways of cooking food and all these things that help even the people on the low end. So even if inequality is raising, like I live in a not great area in a very, very cheap apartment, and yet I still have a bunch of luxuries to people 50 years ago. Like I still have a laptop I'm recording this on. I still have an iPhone. I still have an iPad. So I really think they undersold the capitalism side in this debate, which was, to me, very disheartening because they kind of agreed on a weird in-between position between not really Marxism, not really capitalism. So I don't know how you feel about that.
Yes, well, I often feel when I'm having these discussions that it breaks down because people can't agree on words. It becomes a question of what do words mean? What does this mean? What and of course that's not really helpful when we're talking about an economic system or a social system because these things affect people's lives. And I don't want semantics. I don't think that's really helpful to get to the heart of the matter, which is what is the best way to organize human society? As I think I said a few minutes ago, what kind of society do we want to live in? And I mean, I can't really add much to what you said. I think I agree that it was half-hearted. You said something earlier that you kind of felt it was I forget the words you used, a show or something like that.
Train wreck.
Train wreck. That was it. I mean, I think it's probably a train wreck, but I think it was an educational train wreck. I got a lot out of it. I would recommend people watch it. Maybe they could have future debates where they get more done. I mean, think about, I think the very first discussion that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had was basically a train wreck because once again, they got bogged down in definition of truth.
Yeah, true. So I definitely agree that this got bogged down in semantics. There was a point where I was taking notes, and once they finished their official rebuttal period and their opening statements, essentially the first thing they got into was an argument of semantics, because there's this moment where Zizek, this was kind of a soundbite moment. Zizek calls out Peterson and says, "Where are these?" What was the word for it? The postmodernist neo-Marxists.
Postmodern
He
neo-Marxists.
says name one, and he gets all mad about it. And the thing was, I actually thought Peterson did a good job of defending the term, but Zizek doesn't want to concede it because he has a different idea of what Marxism constitutes. Because Peterson then explains, well, it's these people who take intersectionality and they put it in this form of oppressed and oppressor, and then they use that Marxist mindset to explain this whole postmodernist lens. And then Zizek kind of is unsatisfied. You can tell he's not happy with it because he thinks Marxism is the collection of all of Marx's words in all of his volumes, and then kind of Hegelian, and then he comes to his own Marxist formulation and not the Communist Manifesto talks about the proletariat for 50 pages. So that was kind of a shame to watch. And it kind of wasn't Jordan Peterson debating a classic Marxist like I expected. So yeah, semantics are an issue. I did think Zizek had a lot of interesting points, but I don't know if this is me. I'm going to say this because this might get a little bit of controversy here. Zizek seemed to kind of contradict himself a lot. And I think that's kind of something that he's okay with. I think that's part of being a Hegelian a little bit. But he essentially painted China as this bad guy. Because
he painted who? I'm sorry?
China.
Yeah.
Because he didn't like the authoritarianism. I don't think Zizek is an authoritarian at all. I think he's weirdly like a Marxist anarchist. But he kind of says that the reason China works is because it's capitalist and authoritarian. And if you had democracy there, it would screw it up. And he was actually very against democracy in the sense that he thinks it screws up capitalism. That was my interpretation of his argument. And I just thought that was very strange because he essentially says democracy isn't compatible. The only thing that's compatible with capitalism is authoritarianism, but authoritarianism is bad. So, I mean, if that's his genuine analysis, I understand it, but it seems like that's a set of facts that is a non-starter to work with if you hate authoritarianism. Did you follow that? It was strange.
Well, let me try to repeat your words back to you. So I think So I want to make sure we're on the same page. So okay. Are you saying that the contradiction that you see in Zizek's argument was that China is so successful, but that was so he was painting this China in a far worse light than it should be painted into, or
he was painting China as successful not because of he pretty much said that people will say China is successful, but they would be even more successful if they had democracy instead of authoritarianism. And Zizek rejected that point. He said that China is actually successful because of their authoritarianism capitalism. But he's clearly not an authoritarian. He's like Zizek personally. He clearly thinks authoritarianism is bad.
So you're saying that Zizek rejects the idea that a democracy in China would work.
Yeah, pretty much.
I would have to think about that more.
No, I totally get that. It was a weird point for him to bring up because he essentially rallied against democracy in the sense that he finds it inefficient, but he was in favor of authoritarianism because he finds authoritarianism efficient. I think that the reason why I guess I'm drawing on this point is I think I find something incredibly inaccurate about believing that central planning would work in most capacities. And I think that that's his implication, is that authoritarianism is efficient with capitalism because once you can central plan it, everything can go as you want and it'll be perfect.
And you don't think it is?
Well, I just think in general, central planning won't work in the long term. I think he's overstating how good China's doing. They borrowed a ton of money and their growth was slowing. And if their growth slows, then they're not going to be able to pay back any of their loans and they're screwed. I think he was essentially saying China is successful and chalking it up to authoritarianism, but he didn't really lay out a lot of reasons to prove that China will actually be successful in the long term.
Yes, that's of course an empirical claim. How long will the China in this form continue on? I wanted to touch on an earlier point you mentioned. You brought up when Zizek asked Peterson, "Where are the Marxists?" I think we have a slightly different take on that. I thought that was actually a fair point. I think. I mean, I know when Peterson constantly brings up, these postmodern neo-Marxists. Every time that happens, and it's quite often actually, I, my question is, what does that mean? I feel like that's just another bit of semantics. I think I think if I understand Peterson correctly, or Peterson's arguments, I think it would be better if he said political correctness. I think that would get his point across more. I think he gets stuck in this jargon. Once again, I just I haven't run into any postmodern neo-Marxists that I can think of.
Okay, I think this is where we do break up a little bit. Maybe it's just my experience in college, but there's actually a moment of clarity for me, because I kind of think that's a grandiose term, postmodern neo-Marxist. It sounds kind of funny. It's a very provocative phrase. Jordan Peterson usually says it with kind of anger, like these postmodern neo-Marxists, and he's like very upset about it, and he shouts at people. But he actually was put in a position where he kind of had to explain the term, and I actually walked away with it. It clicked for me. So I think he's talking about a very specific group of people in academia, where it's people who are postmodern in the sense that they don't really believe in any kind of truth. They see a lot of life as your experience is like your subjective truth, right? And that's how they get to like the more intersectionality type of issues where they say, well, this group is here because, they're oppressed by this group. The way they frame it a lot of times is in the term of oppressed and oppressor. And the relation to Marxism is just, it looks at it as an economic lens of oppressed and oppressor. So you lose the economics part in the discussion there when he defines it. But I think it's the academics who look at it a certain way. And I normally don't think a lot of academics are like that. But I went to a state school. I took a class called Politics of Identity. It was a gen ed. And we talked about pretty much life experiences as different minorities. And we talked about, we essentially did a whole class on equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. And when I take the class was very surface level. We didn't have a textbook. It was a gen ed at a state school. So it wasn't a serious class. But when I draw the meta, like topics from each little things we studied, it was essentially the same framework of what he proposed postmodern neo-Marxists are. It was very similar. Now, it's really just, I think, Zizek doesn't like his use of Marxist in that phrase. That's why I think he was so adamant. But I think, to some extent, I think that phrase has validity.
Well, of course, you've had more college experience being a graduate than I have, so I will defer to you. But I somewhat agree with you, actually, in the sense, or in the sense that academia is far more left-leaning. That's probably always been true, as far as I can tell. And in fact, I'm taking a religion class right now. We're just breaking down all the different kinds of religions. And then we got to Islam, and I noticed, because this is a whole other different conversation, so I won't go too deeply into this, but I noticed that the unit on Islam was very watered down in my view. It was in fact a very political unit, because it was going so far. The class was going so far as to say that the rise of Islamic fundamentalism is at least in part blamed by U.S. foreign policy, and it was talking about how a lot of these, fundamentalist Islam or Muslims aren't real Muslims. And I of course I did the work, and as the instructor wanted it, but I could tell that it was a political. There was a political message being sent that I don't think was accurate.
Yeah, that is a whole nother topic. I think that's kind of funny, because I was thinking about that same issue today. But it's funny because that's not a very empirical take. It's a very you can't really prove that it's worsened. So that there's a balance when you talk about Islamic radicalism between if it's their ideology or if it's the fault of the U.S. foreign policy.
Of course.
And the thing is, too, it shouldn't be politically incorrect to say it's the ideology, because you can write it off as saying it's people that misread their ideology, and there are plenty of peaceful people, and that's the real issue is radicals. So it shouldn't even be that offensive to say that. But I could see why, if somebody was being hyper politically correct, or it was in a textbook or something, and if they immediately jump and blame it on the U.S., then it means there is no easily misinterpreted part of their religion. But yeah, that is a whole new topic that I would say that I'm not the most educated person on, but I think it's an interesting and fascinating debate. Do you have more to say on specifically about this Peterson Zizek debate? Is there any other parts that jumped out to you?
I'm skimming my notes here quickly just to make sure I covered everything, or covered the main topics.
I'll go on a brief rant real quick then, because there's a small part, and it's just a thing that I didn't like what Jordan Peterson did there at all.
So you go ahead. I'll look at this over, and I can add a little more when you're done, and then we'll move on.
Cool. So there's this part where it's right when they open up to be able to ask each other questions, Peterson and so Peterson pretty much says to his opponent, "You don't defend the Communist Manifesto, yet people who are younger and watch your content see you as a proponent of Marxism. I think you're lending too much credibility to Marxism because people typically associate Marxism with the bad ideas that are in the Communist Manifesto. So because of that, isn't that terribly shameful?" And I absolutely hated that part from Peterson, just because I feel like that is what people on the left accuse people on the right of all the time in U.S. politics, where they say something along the lines of, well, even if you don't support this bad thing, since people misinterpret you as supporting this bad thing, don't you think you're a bad person? And I feel like that is like such a spin that was, I like Peterson was kind of stumbling through it, because I think he was still coping with the fact that he didn't actually conceptualize Marxism the same way as his debate partner. But the words that came out of his mouth as he was trying to figure it out and think through the process, it was just this reasoning that I see all the time, and I could not stand. I was just like, do not throw him under the bus for something he doesn't believe because people misconstrue it. Sure, it'd be great if he didn't identify as a Marxist, if he disagrees with the Communist Manifesto, but don't blame him for it. That's not a tactic I want to see from people in a ideologically open environment. So that irked me, but that was the biggest thing that specifically bugged me during the whole debate.
Thank you. I'll give my final thoughts, and then we can move on to the next story. I think the reason I side more with Zizek in this debate or discussion, it's more of a discussion, let's be honest, than with Peterson is I think conservatives and even quite often many liberals they get historical tunnel vision, and you know, any question of, you know, could this be better, or you know, maybe should we look at this some more, I think gets misconstrued into, well, you know, you're crazy, this is, you know, how it's gonna be, this is the best we got, and I if there's one point that Zizek and I completely agree on, it's on the it's in the fact that I think we can always look at society and try to make improvements. I think there's always room for improvement. There's always room for trying to make the world a better place. You know, I guess I won't speak for Zizek, but I don't think he's trying to craft a utopia. I'm certainly not trying to craft a utopia. And my final point, I think my issue with these postmodern neo-Marxist moniker is something else Zizek said. He called it, let's see, he said political correctness is hyper-moralization, which is a slight, let's see, I don't have the exact quote here, but basically saying political correctness is the left's admission of defeat. It's like the last stand. It's the the cat trying to get, at least scratch you up before you capture it and put it in its cage. And so I guess maybe in a way I'm more pessimistic than Peterson is. I think political correctness is, in the short term, it might be winning, but I think in the long term it will be a complete disaster. That's
nice.
Yeah. I'll wrap it up.
I'm sure as we cover more topics and go over more stories, we'll talk more about things that are going on that are related to political correctness and capitalism. I think I could better formulate my defense of capitalism in the future, but I'll just save it till then because I think we covered the topic pretty well. And if anybody's interested in it, check it out. You could probably find it on YouTube. It is hard to follow Zizek a lot because if you're not familiar with him, not only does he say things that are crazy and you're not sure what is necessarily or what he's going for, but he also has a very hard accent to understand. So that was a struggle for his opening remarks for me. So keep that in mind. But I think this topic flows into another thing that came out this week, which was Ray Dalio. So he is a hedge fund manager, very well known. He had this book come out last year that was topped the New York Times bestseller called Principles. Huge, it's like a 400-page book all about essentially how he goes about decision making in life. And he's a guy who's made hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions. So if you're going to take advice, you might want to take it from him. But he dips his toe into the realm of politics, and I wasn't necessarily a big fan. So pretty much he posted a LinkedIn post about how capitalism's failing. And to summarize it to a bit of an extent, he pretty much, in part one, he kind of talks about his own life, his upbringing. He talks about essentially why the economy worked when he was younger, which he's an older guy. So he was kind of reminiscing on why it worked then. And then he goes on to talk about rampant inequality, and he gives a plethora of statistics. I'm not going to go into any individually because there are some that I think are a bit misleading, but that's not really the point. So he talks about income inequality, he talks about education, and he essentially makes the claim that capitalism perpetuates the income inequality and the income inequality perpetuates itself. And then he wraps it up by breaking down what he thinks we should do in the future. So I think the thing I want to start with is I just want to have a general discussion about inequality, because the way I've always had it framed to me, and this is even as a person who went through economics classes, I don't see the issue inherently with inequality. I see the issue with poverty. So there are stats he lays out that's about people who are in very bad situations, and it sucks. But that's the issue, not the inequality of it. Like the fact that I know some people who make $50,000 and I know some people who makes $100,000, their disparity isn't the issue at all. If the guy who's making $50,000 made $10,000 a year, then that would probably be a problem. So I see the issue as poverty, not income inequality. I don't know if you defend income inequality as the big issue, because I know that you're more on the left than I am, clearly. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, push back on me, feel free.
Thank you. I was just looking at the article. This sentence spoke to me. He said, "The problem is that capitalists typically don't know how to divide the pie well, and socialists typically don't know how to grow it well." Which is, I think, I mean, I'm not gonna be rude or anything, but I suspect he thought he was a bit more profound than he actually was. I mean, that's not I don't feel like that's a big shocker to anybody, statements like that.
Well, I mean, that's a very commonplace sentiment.
Exactly.
I don't think I agree with it though, which is where I think you and I set apart. I think you agree with that sentiment, and I honestly really don't. Did I shock you with that right there?
Oh, that you disagreed with the statement? No.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, I'm not even sure I agree with it in the sense that it's I feel like it's become a useless platitude, and I try to avoid those.
Well, see, I think the issue there is, well, I think capitalism is our system of economic. Well, it's our economic system. People buy goods and sell goods. So that's the only way you're going to have economic growth is through, people engaging in consensual transactions. So you start from there, and then he says, what was the exact phrasing? I'm pulling it up right there. Socialists typically don't know how to grow well. Okay, capitalists don't know how to divide the pie well. Well, you're assuming the problem with that sentence to me is you're assuming that a collective pie of all the wealth in the United States is something that is meant to be divided in a centralized fashion. I just don't concede that my wealth is part of subnational pot automatically, like 100% of my wealth should be thrown in there and then it should be divided by a socialist. That's where I don't like that thinking at all. And I think it gives away a lot of his deeper ideology, that all the accumulation of society is meant to be divided in some sort of way. I think we have property rights for a reason. So he loses me at point one right there.
So again, I'm going to try to repeat your words. So I'm keep trying to make sure we're on the same page again. So your issue with him is that you see the issue, or you see, I guess the issue really is conceptual, is that we shouldn't view wealth really as a country's wealth. We should view it more as the wealth of individuals and companies and groups, correct?
Yeah. And I feel that same way about if you talk about international trade, where they say it's like you're forgetting that it's a company in a different country and a person here. It's like you're talking like the US government trades with China's government, and then it's people trading across borders. It's the same thing, but I find that conception very poor.
No, I don't have a problem with that either. I would agree. I mean, I do think capitalism is failing America, but
So I'll agree with you in some sense that capitalism is failing because there are some shortcomings. Like I don't think capitalism gives people meaning in life, but I don't think that's the economic system's job. So that's what I see. So to be more specific on what Dalio sees, he partially weirdly, I thought this was weird. He kind of blames the Federal Reserve to some extent because he says the way the Federal Reserve works, it ends up keeping stocks artificially inflated. Then he pretty much says rich people benefit the most from this. And then there's
isn't that generally a libertarian argument?
Well, that's what I thought when I was reading it, but that's because but libertarians walk into the conversation with the idea that the Fed can actually not exist. So then a libertarian says, so then you get rid of the Fed. The Fed's the problem. Nobody on 95% of America who has like any status would agree with that. All of them think the Fed is very important for using things, but I have a lot of problems with the Fed. But so he starts from the premise of this is what happens because of the Fed. Now there's too much money up top, and that money should be spread out. So what are we going to do about it, guys? So a lot of people might say, well, maybe that's the Fed's problem. Maybe we shouldn't artificially print more money when most of it goes to rich people, but that's not his diagnosis. So I guess what I found so fascinating was I agreed with him that a lot of things were problems, but I didn't agree with his solutions. So he talks about schools a lot. Bad schools are underfunded. And he pretty much says that companies that profit should donate tons of money to schools. That's what I got out of this. I'm not sure if... I wish he was more concise at some point so I could pull it up easier right there. Maybe I should have taken a little bit of notes on it. But it seemed like he was suggesting that these places should donate money. But he doesn't suggest that maybe there are alternative systems to the public school system that might be good. And then that's where I think a lot of work could be done, especially for poor people. Because right now, rich people get better education for their kids because they're the only ones who can send their kids to private schools. But if people had school choice, then it would increase accessibility to private schools for poor kids. And I feel like that's an easy solution. That's like, hey, look, here's an idea. Throw this out there. And he doesn't even touch anything about school choice. He just says public schools are underfunded. Give them more money. So that was thing one I wanted to bring up.
So, are you are more for private schools than public schools?
No, I'm for school choice. I
School
think
choice. Okay.
there's a distinction.
If
there.
you want to send your kid to public school, you can. If you want to send them to private school, you can.
Yeah.
Okay.
I probably caught you off guard a little bit by bringing that up.
Yeah.
So pretty much how it works in my mind is I hear a lot of people on the left hating on private schools for good reason, because right now only rich kids can get in private schools. Then you're a kid, you get a better education in private school because you're wealthy. Wow, that sucks if you're not wealthy enough. Like, hey, I didn't grow up in a poor family, but there was no way in hell I was going to a private school. Luckily, I went to a good public school. Now, some people are in areas where they only have one public school and it sucks. I live in a big city where that is definitely the case around where I live. If you empowered parents if you empowered parents with a voucher or something of the sort that is equal to the funding that would go to the public school if they chose not to go there, because the way schools are funded is for a kid who attends, they get a certain amount of money. So if you gave that amount of money to a parent and said, here's a voucher, then suddenly the poorer families who are priced out of private schools could potentially afford sending their kid to a different solution that might be better. And if you empower poor families to do this, then you're automatically opening up the market, and then a bunch more private schools can open. So ones where there's areas where there are no private schools, they could open because now suddenly there's people who can afford it with their vouchers. So I think he gives like the most textbook Democrat. Here you go, just give them more money, make the rich businesses that are profiting pay for it. Now they won't be underfunded. And it's like, this is so short-sighted. You're not adding competition. You're assuming the problem is funding when that's not true in LA County, where they have one of the highest funded public schools. Like per student, they're paid a certain amount that's like ridiculous compared to most of the country, and their schools are pretty awful. So, yeah, I was frustrated by that.
I agree. It's a pretty textbook Democrat argument, which is, I read it, but I didn't. As I say, I do think capitalism is causing a lot of problems, but I don't. I'm not going to be running to his defense, just because, as I say, I think he's kind of peddling, these old ideas of, hey, look at poor, or we need to fix these issues, and more money, and as you say, and it's just, I suspect. I think capitalism is failing, but probably in a somewhat different way than this gentleman would say so.
So there's only one more thing I really want to touch on, because there's a few good points he has. He's a business guy, so he says that you should establish clear metrics and stick with them when you evaluate certain ideas and how they work, which is exactly what the government should do. That's more government accountability. That'd be good, because you don't really hear about stuff like that. But there's one point that I think you would be interested in a lot. Because I think it's a little bit of I think it's a bit philosophical in one way. So he says, bipartisan and skilled shapers of policy working together to redesign the system so it works better. I believe that we will do this in a bipartisan and skilled way, or we will hurt each other. So I believe the leadership should create a bipartisan committee to bring together skilled people from different communities to come up with a plan to re-engineer the system to simultaneously divide and increase the economic pie better. That plan will show how to raise money and spend/invest it well to produce good double bottom line returns. So his idea, I guess, is you create a committee, you throw 5 capitalists on it and 5 socialists on it, and then you say, go ahead, fix the problems. I don't know about you, but I feel like that's not going to be an effective approach. If you heard somebody say that, do you have like an immediate reaction to this, or is it just striking me as very idealistic?
It strikes me as a pretty prototypical thing for him to say. That's kind of what politicians do. They, make committees and okay, go off and fix this problem.
Yeah.
Uh,
I was just reading that and I was like, when has a bipartisan committee on like if you look at Congress, they have so many random committees that they establish, and they make a bipartisan committee, and it says organize a study on this, and they do nothing. They just get a study done, right? This felt like more of the same, and he's not even running for the Democratic nomination. He's just a hedge fund manager, and he's promoting like these groundbreaking fixed capitalism ideas as create a committee, put socialists and capitalists on it. It's like, what is your scheme here? But there was a abstract philosophical point I wanted to get to, which I
do better with that.
Yeah, this kind of gets back to, you mentioned Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris. They had one of I think it was their first debate in like Vancouver. So when it was not the podcast, but it was actually a debate. Peterson said something along the lines of, they're like an infinite amount of facts. That's why facts aren't important to him. They aren't truth. It's the framework you use to understand the facts that is important. So you have to have. So he's pretty much suggesting we should do something that is not ideological. This is Ray Dalio's whole point. We don't need ideology. We need just this bipartisan coming together. But I think if you don't have a way of perceiving the facts on the ground, then you can't really even work with it. You're just putting people together on a committee. You're saying, do what's practical. Well, what is practical? You're not defining goals in this sense. You're just saying, be practical. I find that flawed. I think a lot of moderate people say that, and I don't know what it means.
Yes, I agree. I think I remember the part of the conversation between Peterson and Harris you're referring to. I think if I remember correctly, Harris probably dismissed that idea that there are an infinite number of facts. And Peterson, I guess, well, he's the one who said it, so I guess he believes it. Yeah, no, I maybe this surprises you, but yes, I agree. I think we need, another person I think brings this up quite often is Professor Noam Chomsky. I don't remember where exactly, but not too long ago, if it might have been some article or some interview or something or other, he was saying, academics.
Alive? Is he still alive?
Yeah, it was like 89 or something.
Okay, I saw a clip of him, and he looked old in it, and the clip looked like it was 10 years old, and I just assumed he was dead. So, okay.
No, he's still alive and giving a lot of. He's still teaching, I think. But I brought him up to say, yeah, I think he also said something about we shouldn't care much about ideas. Academics get too bogged down in ideas. We just need to do stuff that helps the people. And I said, I guess I can see where he's coming from, but I kind of disagree. I think ideas matter. And I think your ideas will affect how you try to help other people, or try to run a society as a whole. I guess I'm sorry if you were looking for more of a disagreement, but I think we agree on this.
Yeah. I just think it's this way that people try to bring scientific thinking to the soft sciences, and they act like there's this economic principle called opportunity cost. And it's me doing this podcast with you right now means I'm not doing an infinite amount of things I could have done with an hour of my life. So there is a weird cost in that sense. So when you talk about a policy like, say, the minimum wage, you can say raising the minimum wage is good for the people. But then if you look at the data, a lot of people's wages go up, and then a few people get their hours cut or lose their jobs because they just aren't that productive. So then you're making the value judgment that a lot of people improving is better than a few people losing some status. So you're making this value judgment that is not objectively true. You've made this subjective value judgment. And I feel like that's what a lot of people do in this debate when they talk about, a lot of socialists do it too. It's this kind of it's like people in our age range that up to in the 18 to 30 range. They do this a lot. They're like, it's because that's the policy that's factually true. It's like you are assuming that, like, say, people's economic freedom has a value of 0, and that is a subjective evaluation you made. I think it's very important, so my calculation is different. Yours is not more objective than mine, because we have to take into account these things that are intangible. So yeah, that's why Dalio's bipartisan shtick kind of irked me.
Well, I think we should be very careful, or at least I try to be very careful. I don't call something a fact until I've done the research and it's pretty much been empirically proven. I tend to I always say, well, I think this is the policy we should go down or follow through with, or I think I have this analysis of it. I try not to say, all I'm doing is reporting facts, and anyone who disagrees with me is factually incorrect, because once again, it's like, okay, well, what do you mean by fact?
Well, that's why, I mean, you know this, but I became a conservative by way of Ben Shapiro. I was pretty apolitical. I thought I was very Republican. Then I heard Ben Shapiro, and then I've been listening to his podcasts like pretty much every day for like 3 years. And I don't agree with him as much as I did when I first started to. But his whole shtick, facts over feelings, is the dumbest thing ever to me, because you say the facts that support your argument based on your ideological framework that you work from, right? So you can have an honest disagreement and both report facts. You just care about the same facts differently, which is why there's genuine disagreements. And that's why I don't think other people are evil for disagreeing with me, or I don't think they're stupid. I just think they subjectively evaluate things differently than me. I mean, I don't think they should. I think they're wrong for doing it. I think they should subjectively value things the way I do. But it's not just as simple as this is the facts, so this is the answer. This is the facts, consider what those facts mean, and then make the decision based on the meaning of the facts. So I think we're in agreement there. I do think for next week we're going to have to come up with a dozen topics, and then make sure we disagree on like 2 of them, because I want to get some like. I want you to throw some stuff at me, and then I want to yell about freedom or something.
You can't have light without heat, someone once said.
Well, it is funny though that we're sitting here mostly agreeing on things through about an hour, because I'm definitely not going to vote Democrat. I'm just going to say that as a fact. I'm a registered Republican. I don't like Republicans, but I'm not going to. And I do not think there is any chance you're going to vote Republican. Yeah, we sit here and we talk about relatively political things and agree for the most part for about 45 minutes to an hour.
Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I suspect, maybe this is a generational thing. Who knows? But I think, I haven't said this on this recording, but I think when we first had a Skype call, not Skype call, the Jitsi call, I think we're both, we think for ourselves. I mean, it sounds, once again, I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to say, we're not following the sheeple, we're better than everybody else. Like, no, but I think, I suspect that the both of us are, we don't just take ideas in. I think some people, no offense, probably are kind of like sponges. They just take ideas in. I suspect we hear an idea and like, is that right? I think we tend to look into it more.
I think we both immediately say, that's stupid and wrong. And then we think about it.
Exactly.
So how about you talk just a little bit about Sri Lanka, and then maybe I'll do a couple of concluding thoughts about next week, and we'll wrap this up.
Sure. Of course, the original article I had was, I think it was from the Washington Post, but new data has come in, so I'm now going to use an article from CBS News. Well, to give you context, so the church Christian Catholic, I think, Catholic churches and some hotels where Catholic services were being held were attacked, were bombed on Easter Sunday. Apparently, the death toll has risen to 321 people. ISIS claims responsibility for it, but the Sri Lankan government says no, it was just some local extremist group that did it. 40 people have been arrested. But there's and another thing the Sri Lankan government said is they believe it's also a retaliation against the attack against the terrorist attack against some mosques in New Zealand. And that's about really there isn't much else. So we're not sure exactly what happened. It would be silly of me to say I'm against this because duh.
Yeah. Yeah, we are both, for the record, against innocent people being killed in terrorist attacks.
Yeah, but I feel like that's obvious.
Yeah, I know.
I feel like most people. I mean, unless you're, unless you just really, really hate people or a member of, some horrible terrorist group, I think you're going to say, killing innocent people for politics or religion, not a good idea.
Yeah. The only thing I wanted to add was apparently the Sri Lankan government did get some tips about the attacks and they could have stopped it, but they had some miscommunications and did not, considering that hundreds of people are dead and injured. So yeah. I'm sure a lot more is going to come out about this by the next time we record. So we might have some more thoughts. It's just it was a really sad day that happened on Easter. Targeted attacks like that are horrible, and it sucks to see something like that happen.
Well, yeah, and I'll just add one thing. I'm not a very religious person. Well, I'm not religious at all. But I don't. Despite me not being religious, I'm strongly against any desecration of holy sites or monuments or destruction or of them. I mean, I think. I don't have to be Catholic to say, leave the Catholics alone. Let them celebrate Easter in peace. And if you do not, you are the problem, not them.
Yeah. And yeah, the shame of the whole event is the way U.S. politics work is they quickly take an event and it devolves into a meta-analysis of how people are talking about the events. So right now, the worst part is hundreds of people died, yet conservatives are complaining that the mainstream media isn't describing the churchgoers as Catholics or Christians or whatever they actually were. That's not in the description going on. And then people on the left, there were a couple really bad pieces out about how the people who are angry about this are essentially members of the alt-right. So a lot of bad commentary coming out of the U.S. based on international tragedies. Wow. Well, what can I say? We've stooped pretty low, but I don't have a lot of high hopes. But yeah, so we've been going for a while. There was one topic that we might push till next week. I don't know if we'll get the chance to cover it. I wanted to talk a little bit about what Ben and Jerry's had to say about 420. But that would seem inappropriate to do now, given the fact that it's a thing about 420 after talking about a bunch of people getting killed on Easter. So next week, I'm thinking that we'll dig up things from the news that we disagree with more. I'm saying that now, so I remember to bring that up when we put stories together. Because hopefully we'll have things to actually argue about instead of just, or we'll be able to prepare more so we can argue. Because if you'd probably push back on school choice more if you knew I was going to bring that up, maybe. That's just a hunch I have. So we'll do a little bit more foresight on a few random things. And yeah, we're recording on Tuesday, so if you hear this later and more news is out, don't blame us for missing it. And that's
Tuesday,
pretty much it.
April 23rd, 2019.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, signing off. This is Matt. And then I stop recording now.